Hello and welcome to Azure's Live Mert to the Future. Today I have a very special guest. Abdul Kazi will be with us and we will be talking about Azure landing zones. Hi Abdul, welcome. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to presenting and very nice meeting you virtually. Finally, I know we've been talking back and forth. So, yeah, finally, nice to put a face to the name.
Thank you very much and nice to meet you too. So this is my classical question. And can you please introduce yourself and your community activities?
Sure, absolutely. So, that actually gives me this next slide. So, my name is Abdul Kazi. I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years now, 7 years in the Azure space. I work for a Microsoft Azure MSP partner out of Canada. So I live in Toronto, Canada, and I'm very active in the Azure community. So I have an active blog. I do a lot of speaking for the community. So um, make sure you connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Uh, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. A lot of people reach out and say, okay, we're looking for guidance. So I also provide mentorship for any students or anybody who's looking to move into the Azure space specifically. So let's get into our topic. Before we get into the topic, let's talk about the agenda. So here's going to be the agenda for today's talk: cloud adoption motivations, why moving to the cloud, the value that really cloud ready environments produce, basically. Then we'll talk about the cloud adoption framework because it is a stepping stone to the landing zone, because landing zone is a subset of cloud adoption framework. Then we'll talk about the Azure landing zones. Then we talk about the actual design areas. There are different design areas we'll talk about. We'll talk about Azure Blueprints. And lastly, Azure Policy. So as I mentioned, about the cloud adoption motivations. So depending on what your journey looks like to the cloud, you might be moving into the cloud uh, for many reasons. One of the reasons I've talked to customers is they want to exit their on-prem data center, they want to exit their co-location, or they're mainly looking for high availability or disaster recovery, right? So they're trying to have another data center. So rather than have a physical data center, it's feasible to go into the cloud, because the cloud model has what has done really a paradigm shift, if you will. What that means is, think about from a on-prem aspect, right? I mean, you were buying anything for on-prem servers, switches, hardware, what have you. Mainly, it was done on a capital expenditure, capex, right? You would buy everything outright, and depending on your company policy, you would be depreciating it for 3, 5, 7 years. Now, with the cloud, everything has moved to a capex model. So, sorry, OPEX model, operational expenditure. So basically, what happens is whatever you consume, you pay for that. And the biggest challenge with cloud is consumption. Think about your electricity bill. Um, the more you consume, the more the bill is going to be. It's not like hardware, right? You bought a hardware, spend, and then you can have unlimited virtual machines. Not unlimited, but you can use it however you want. There's no extra cost. The challenge with cloud is you have to be very cognizant of the cost. That's why when you're going into the cloud, there has to be a lot of planning done. So those are also the motivators, right? You want to lower down your costs. So that's another motivator to going to cloud. You're looking for high availability. You're looking for scalability. You won't get scalability in, technically in on-prem environment. Cloud is very scalable. The other use case for moving to the cloud is if you have a test F environment. So what that means is, let's say you have a project for testing an application for just 6 months. It doesn't really make sense to buy all the hardware, set it up, in your on-prem environment. The ideal situation is you go in the cloud, you set up that environment, and after 6 months, you're done with it, right? So there's no cost because you only paid for those 6 months. After that, there's no cost and there's no issue. So these are really the big motivators for moving to the cloud. Now let's take a look at the value. What value the cloud brings to us. So I've kind of also mentioned about the nimbleness, so cutting edge innovation. So cloud actually provides that. The other thing is cloud provides security. So Microsoft is investing $1 billion, yes, with a B, $1 billion in security alone per year to make sure cloud is secure. So cloud really has become their bread and butter. So if you look at Microsoft earning reports, cloud is one of their biggest revenue sources now. So cloud is really becoming big now. And before you move to the cloud, you have to be cognizant of the cloud, that what changes is cloud going to bring to your environment, and you have to be ready for those changes. Because here's the biggest challenge I see. If you're moving from on-prem to the cloud, you cannot bring your on-prem mentality to the cloud, because cloud doesn't work like on-prem. What I mean by that is cloud is actually very, very flat, meaning if you, in a typical organization, and I'm talking about an enterprise customer, a on-prem IT department would be very decentralized, meaning there would be a department or a group of people who will be managing a server, right? The other team would be managing networking, so firewall, switches, what have you. The other person might be doing just operations, backup, patch management, and what have you. With cloud, it's flat in a sense that you have to do pretty much everything on the go. So when you come to the cloud, you have to provision a virtual machine, you'll have to provision storage, networking, you have to set up a backup, patch management. So that's why I said cloud is very flat. So that's one of the biggest issues I'm seeing with a lot of people moving to the cloud. They're not ready, and it requires a different mindset and different skill set when you move to the cloud. So that's why I said cloud-ready environment is very important, not only from a growth aspect, but from a compliancy aspect. And we'll talk more into detail about this, but from a compliancy aspect, right? When you are in your own prem data center, you're in your own physical location. So from a compliance standpoint, it's not an issue. But when you move to the public cloud, that is going to be an issue, because depending on your region. So for me, I am in Canada. Canada has 2 regions, Canada East and Canada Central. Now, if I have a compliance requirement to keep my data in Canada, and I cannot have my data in Europe or US, then I have to comply. So that changes a lot of things. So you have to figure those things out. You have to figure out the requirements from a compliance aspect. Okay, does GDPR apply to us? Does SOC apply to you? Right? So those things have to be accounted for before you even start moving to the cloud. So a lot of companies, they just start moving to the cloud a little bit haphazardly and fairly quickly. These decisions have to be made. And we'll see how the landing zone really does a great job of putting a stepping stone for you to be ready to move to the cloud. So now let's talk about the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, which is referred as CAF, is a collection of documentation, technical guidance, best practices, and tools that really provides the customers for cloud adoption. So anybody moving into the cloud would be using these guidelines. And actually, the thing is, this actually came from Microsoft. So Microsoft technology services, their consulting people were using this to deploy, and then Microsoft made this public a couple of years ago for everybody to use. So this is a great framework. And as you can see on the screen, the circle is rotating, meaning it is a ongoing thing. When we move to the cloud, people think, okay, I've moved my workload and I'm done. No, it's a reoccurring process, because you might have one workload today. In 6 months, you might have a different workload, which requires different skill set, which might require different process, which might require even different policies. So for example, let's say today you might be moving into Azure, just doing lift and shift through IaaS, infrastructure as a service. And then 6 months later on, you might want to use PaaS services, platform as a service. Those, although both are in Azure, it's a very different requirement, skill set, process, because both have different unique features that you have to look into. So that's why it's always a balancing act, that how you adopt and how you are aligned. So let's move along to the next. So let's talk about the cloud adoption framework itself. So there are 5 different phases, if you will, of the cloud adoption framework. So the first one is the define phase. Basically, define means is you're justifying a business. You're doing a business justification, or to say, okay, what is going to be the expected outcome for us to move to the cloud, right? So you'll have to go to your management, and specifically the financial folks, the CFO, the controllers. They're looking and saying, okay, what is the ROI for us to move to the cloud? Why should we move to the cloud? So there's always going to be a business plan. So that's the first phase. The second one is going to be the plan phase. So in the plan phase, you really create and align an actionable adoption plan, to make sure that there is a plan for you to move to the cloud. The third phase is the ready phase. So ready phase is really where you prepare your environment. And actually, ready phase is the phase where you have the landing zone. So when I'm going to be talking about the landing zone actually sits in the ready state, right? Because you're getting the environment ready before the migration. And the next phase is adopt. So adopt actually has 2 phases. One is going to be the migrate. So the perfect example for migrate is if you're doing a lift and shift, meaning you have a on-prem environment with either Hyper-V or VMware, and you want to move them as is. So, you just migrate them as is. That's mainly a lift and shift. Then you have, or you can do innovate. What that means is, let's say you have some applications which are not compatible for the cloud. So you might have to rehost them. You might have to go back and rewrite them. So that's where the innovation piece comes in. They're more adaptive to the cloud, and they might be more on the platform as a service side rather than on the infrastructure as a service. So it really depends what you want to do with the cloud. Some people begin with the migrate because they want to have one step closer to the migration. It's an easy way to get into the cloud. So they start with lift and shift, and then after that, they start modernizing their existing workload in the cloud, and then move in the innovate direction. The next one is the governed state. For me, this is the most critical phase of the cloud adoption framework, and I'll tell you why. Here's the reason. So when people are moving to the cloud, obviously you would define a strategy, right? Because you have to define a strategy to get management buy-in. Then you have to have a plan. you have to have the Azure environment ready. Then, so the ready phase is there, and then on the adapt phase, you're doing a migration. So either the migrate migrate way, or you do the innovate way, right? Using the tool Azure Migrate or third-party tools. But the govern phase, people tend to omit because, it doesn't really affect us now. We're not going to come. We're not going to basically get bothered about it. Let's leave it. Let's maybe tackle govern in the future. The challenge is if it doesn't get tackled, it is going to cause a lot of problems. So, for example, I'll talk about naming conventions. If you do not properly assign the proper naming convention from the get-go, it is going to be a pain to change in the future. As you might know, there's no way you can do a naming change on the resources or resource groups. Yes, on the subscription you can, so those kind of things. And I recently did a talk on Azure governance, so I talked about all of these things. So I highly recommend you go take a look, and from a governance standpoint, that's going to help. And lastly, we talk about the manage piece. So manage is conducting operations management for the cloud. And if you have on-prem, it's going to be hybrid cloud, right? So management is going to be for the cloud very different than on-prem environment. Same policies are not going to apply. Same governance is not going to apply. Your RTOs, RPOs might change even. So there are a lot of things that you have to account for before you even jump into the cloud or start the migration. So that's why Microsoft actually came out with the cloud adoption framework. It gives you a good point of direction that how things should be done. So once you have a better idea of the cloud adoption framework, then comes the landing zone. So let's talk about what exactly is a Azure landing zone. And landing zone actually is not only prevalent to Azure. AWS also has landing zone as well. So think of a landing zone as a foundation. So whenever you're building a house or a bridge or a building, right, you lay the foundation down. So this is exactly what a Azure landing zone does for you. So here's the thing. The first time you are going to be setting up a brand new tenant, right? You go in there, you set up the tenant, then you set up your users, Azure AD users, and depending on which direction you're going to go. If you're coming from greenfield environment, then you are going to be going with cloud identity. If you're coming from on-prem hybrid environment, then you'll probably use the Azure AD Connect tool, sync up all the identity, and then go from there, right? So you have that tenant ready now. So what's the next step? The next step is setting up properly the identities, your networking, those things. And we'll talk about the design piece in the next couple of slides. But the whole idea is to have everything properly set up for a framework standpoint to make sure that when you get into Azure, there are no issues. Again, it really helps you from and I've kind of talked about this, from a security aspect, from a governance, networking, and identity as well. So identity all of these can become fairly complicated if not done properly. So the question you might be asking is, okay, what does Azure Landing Zone support from a subscription aspect? So so Azure Landing Zone really supports your enterprise agreements, your CSP, cloud service provider, your MCA, Microsoft customer agreement. And Landing Zone actually is not a product. So if you log into the Azure, or it's not a service. If you log into the Azure portal and type in Azure Landing Zone, it's not going to come. Like if you would go and type Azure resource, or if you say, okay, if you type Azure cost management and billing, yes, that service is going to come. But Azure Landing Zone per se is not really a service. So it is like a framework, and there are services underneath the Azure Landing Zone that make it consistent with the framework. So now, how do you get started? There are multiple ways of doing or implementing landing zone, and depending on the company policy. So Microsoft actually has a landing zone module for Terraform. If you guys are using IAC, infrastructure as a code, there's a Terraform module there. You can do it through Blueprints as well. But the biggest challenge with Blueprints is Blueprint has been in public preview for 2.5 years or something along those lines. It's not GA. So I do not recommend using Blueprint because there's no support, there's no SLA. But ideally, landing zones should be implemented or implemented through Blueprints. That would be the ideal situation. And then depending on your environment as well, because there's enterprise scale landing zone for large enterprise customers, and then you can just go with a standard landing zone. And I'll point out the difference in the next couple of slides. So I know I kind of talked about the different design areas for landing zone, and these are the different design areas. I'm not going to go into each of them into detail because I can talk about each of them as for a couple of hours. So each of the design areas can be a topic for for a talk. So because they're so massive, there's so many things that are included in there, but what we'll talk is we'll talk about identity, we'll talk about resource organization. Networking is very important in my opinion, so we'll talk about that. We won't really talk about governance or business continuity or deployment, because those those things really don't really have a standard, in a sense that every company does operations differently. And I feel like these are the more stepping stone of the landing zone, if you will. So it's better to have these nailed out before you start talking about the other design areas. So as I mentioned, there were landing zones, and there are enterprise landing zones for the large enterprise customer. So if you are a SMB, mid-market, small customer, or you're working with a small partner, you say, okay, what is the minimum I can do for a landing zone? Here's where I would start with. I would start with the RBAC, role-based access control. I would start with networking and naming and tagging, right? So as I mentioned before, naming and tagging is absolutely important, because what happens is, and actually this happened to me with one of the enterprise customers I was working with, they did not have a good strategy for their naming and tagging. And 6 months into their Azure environment, the naming convention was all over the place. They were thinking of redoing it. So that really become a challenge, not only from a time-consuming aspect, but if you do that, there could be some downtime as well. So you have to account for all of those. The other thing is governance and security is going to be important as well. So if you are a big company and enterprise, you might have to abide by GDPR, SOC, HIPAA, FERPA, those kind of things. So for a smaller company, maybe not, but for large organizations, you have to abide by the governance and security policies, because you would be getting audited every year. So that really becomes the question becomes is, okay, how far do you want to go, and what are the things that really need to be addressed from a landing zone standpoint? So let's move into the RBAC. So the RBAC, Azure Role Based Azure Azure Role-Based Access Control, RBAC. So RBAC, basically what happens is when you create the Azure AD tenant, right? You have the Azure AD roles and you have the Azure roles. So there are two different kind of roles. The Azure AD roles are mainly for the user side of things. And then you have the Azure roles. So the Azure roles are mainly for your subscriptions, management groups, your mainly for resources, managing your resources in Azure. So the way it works is you have a security principle. So you have a user, you have a group, and then you have the service principle and managed identity. And then you would be assigning the roles to them, and then the role definition, and then the scope. Ideally, you do not want to assign anybody a owner or contributor role. I do not recommend it. Take the same mentality from the cloud, least privilege, because the more access they have, it's prone to security breaches and whatnot. The other thing I highly recommend is going with custom roles. So as you can see, these are built-in roles, right? Which are natively there. Now, if you want to go with custom roles, you would probably have to buy Azure AD Premium 1 or Premium 2 license. So you'll have to account for that as well. And depending on what you want to do. So let's say if you have somebody who's going to be doing just patch management, you definitely don't want to give them contributor role. You want to have a custom role made for them to make sure they can do backups and they can check backups. So that's very important. And then with RBAC, let's talk about the scope. So you can assign the scope on management groups, subscription resources, and the resource groups as well. And it really depends on the companies. What I've seen is in the larger enterprise customers, they're separating out the line of business by a management group. So your RBAC would be applied on the management group, and then anything under would probably come down, right? So that's one of the biggest things. The other thing is use managed identities wherever you can. So managed identity is really the managed credentials that are authenticated from Azure services. So use that for any. So for example, if you are doing, let's say, a storage, blob storage or some kind of storage, you want to use managed identities for that rather than using a group or user group. And I don't like using users. So create a group and then assign users to it, because the challenge with that is if, and I saw this, one user had contributor permission role, he left, and then nobody actually checked the account. The other challenge is how do you manage this? So you have to go back and iteratively process the permissioning. Every time a person leaves or comes in, you have to go back and make sure that this is taken care of. So this actually does a good job of showing how you can assign the RBAC to resource groups. So, and resource groups can be, as I mentioned, can be assigned, and then you can do tagging. So tagging is very important as well. One of the reasons you want to do tagging is if you're doing inter-department chargeback, you would be assigning tags to all the resources. And then that way you can say, okay, click on this resource, and then you can pull all the cost and then do a chargeback of that. Or if there's a specific project that you want to find out, then tagging is very important, because you might not have all the resources in the same resource group. So that's why tagging also becomes very essential as well. So from a tagging decision guide, so these are different things you can do for tagging. As I mentioned, you can do cost. One of the biggest things we've seen is costing. The other example is for projects. So if you have a project that you want to assign tags to, you can do it that way. So there are multiple different use cases for tagging, but the biggest one I've seen is chargeback for tagging. So that's very important to do. And I'll talk about the policies as well, that policies for tagging should be enforced. So those are going to be the last slides we'll talk about. So let's talk about networking. And I feel like, if anything you take away from today's session is networking, because networking is such a critical and important piece of landing zone. And here's the reason why. So the biggest challenge you could face if you have an on-prem environment is IP address overlapping, right? So a lot of people start jumping into Azure without having any planning. So because Azure doesn't allow overlapping IP addresses from on-prem environment. So let's say you have an on-prem environment, you are going to be connecting to Azure through, let's say, site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute, depending on the environment. You have to really account from that, right? So from a design aspect, that actually is very, very important. The other thing is Azure has some reserved IP addresses that you cannot use. So like 5 IP addresses, I believe, with each subnet. So you have to factor in how much IP addresses you need. And the other thing is there's some services, for example, application gateway, web application firewall, Azure firewall, VPN gateway, that require specific subnets, right? Or sorry, they need dedicated subnets. So you need to plan for those subnets. You need to have those subnets created beforehand. Because if you don't plan for those subnets, then it's going to be a challenge to route the traffic. So those are the pieces that have to come up before you move into Azure, and those are part of the planning. Also plan for future growth as well. I've seen people, not using a longer or bigger CIDR, if you will. I'm not saying go with /16. That might be way too big, but don't go with /28 or the lower one. You have to give some room for growth as well, because your environment is going to grow in 6 months or even a year. You might not know where you are going to land. So definitely plan for that. The other biggest one also is DNS. Was it December? Yeah, December. AWS had some hiccups because of DNS. So DNS really plays a huge role. So if you are a big enterprise customers, you might already have internal DNS. Sure, you can use those for external resources, but ideally you want to use the Azure DNS services for anything for Azure native resolution, because that's ideal there. The other thing I'll talk about is connecting to the environment. Now, again, depending on how big or small you are, you might get away with site-to-site VPN, or you might need a express route. And then the other challenging piece is how do you figure out those SKUs? So like site-to-site VPN, I don't like the basic gateway SKU because it's too basic. There are limitations to it. So choose properly. The other thing is, if you're going with the express route, make sure you're choosing the right SKU, because express route can be expensive, and it can get costly fairly quickly as well. The other thing is, make sure when you are planning, don't have just one express route or one VPN, because that's single point of failure as well. So account all of these things into play. And now let's talk about actually the diagram, the decision tree. Okay, so from a decision tree aspect, um, the first is going to be, do you really require a virtual network? And you say no. Okay, then you move into the PaaS services, your um, web apps, your Azure Functions, and all those kind of services. If you say yes, then obviously you're like, okay, what are we connecting? Are we connecting from on-premise connectivity? You said yes. Okay. Do you need a higher reliability or higher bandwidth? Yes. Then you would go with express route. If you don't, then you can go with a VPN gateway. So those are the options you have to start thinking from the get-go, because from a design aspect, these things make a huge difference. The other thing is VNet peering. I've seen, so VNet peering is basically when you're trying to connect to one VNet, or I guess one resource or resources from one environment to the other, right? So that has to be planned very well, because that takes a lot of time. And then hub and spoke. Ideally, I've seen hub and spoke set up with landing zone, but depending on the environment, that also comes with its own challenges, because I was working with an enterprise customer. They wanted to bring their own firewall, the NVA firewall, from on-prem, because they already had the licenses. They didn't want to use the Azure firewall, even the premium version, which was GA. So that was, I won't say challenging, but it made it more interesting, because we had to figure out, okay, how is the third-party firewall going to fit in? How is that going to, we had to have different hubs and spokes, and we had to create another management group just for that. So it does add more complexity. The other one is the Azure WAF. I was talking to a customer. They're like, yeah, we don't want to use Azure WAF, Web Application Firewall, because no traffic is going to be going through WAF and outside. Everything is going to go through our internal firewall and outside. So we had to do some convincing and say, no, that's not the right way, because that's going to be a lot of latency and all that. So, you have to start thinking from a design aspect and come up for the reasoning why you're going to be doing. But this, I use this personally, this network decision guide. It helps a lot, because then you're making the right decision. And then even from a DNS aspect, you can take a look and see, okay, how DNS is going to affect, and what kind of DNS services can you use if you have your own IaaS custom VMs, or you want to deploy the Azure AD domain services. So now let's move along into governance and how things should look like, right? So there are different factors that are going to influence for you to succeed. There's cost, transparency. So cost is really a big, I don't want to say issue, but it's a balancing act with cost, because you want to make sure that you're utilizing the right resources without breaking the bank. The other one is roles and responsibility. The biggest challenge I've seen with moving to the cloud also is the roles and responsibilities are not properly defined from a RACI aspect too, meaning people don't know what they're doing. Like for on-prem, everything was defined because it wasn't flat. They were managing, for example, the network. So they were managing the firewall, routers, switches, what have you. When they came to the cloud in Azure, because it's flat, they have to do everything. They have to provision the VM. They have to make sure that the IP is properly done. The backups are set up. So RACI becomes a crucial part, and that's where governance comes into play. You have to make sure that this is done accordingly. And then compliance and security. So, from a compliance aspect, as I mentioned, EU, European Union, GDPR comes into play. So you have to make sure that if you have to abide by that, how are you going to plan for that? So these are the main stepping stones when you're moving to Azure. So now let's talk about how your environment is going to be set up. So once you set up the tenant, the Azure tenant, you get a root management group. And then under the root management group, you can have multiple subscriptions that you can bring into through enterprise agreement, through CSP, what have you. But the structure really looks like this. So the management group is there. Under there, you have the subscription, then the resource groups and resources. A lot of companies, what they do is they separate out each line of business from a management group. So each line of business would only have access to the management group and down under. And it makes it easier because they can implement the RBAC, they can implement Azure policies, they can do tagging right on there. And then from a permissioning aspect, it works perfectly because if they were doing it on the root management, then they would have access to the entire Azure environment. So that actually does a great job of managing the environment. So kind of what we already talked about, the management group, subscription, and then resources, and then you can apply different sets of policies and governance up here. So in an ideal situation, when we're talking about subscriptions, this is how you are going to be setting up your subscription, and depending on the line of business as well. So we have two examples up here. This one is really the service process design. So they have set up their subscriptions in a development subscription. They have a lab, QA, and then production. Whereas this one is HR department, accounting and marketing. So it really depends on your business, how the structure is of the business, and how it's going to look like. So, and what I tell people is, don't make this too complicated. And I'll use the example of if you've ever used the Azure Directory, Microsoft Azure Directory, if you use the OUs, organizational units, you can go all crazy with it, meaning, you can even have folders for each department, or you can have folders for users or whatnot. So same thing with this, with subscriptions. You can have subscription for each department, or, go to the user level. Make it simple depending on what you want to do, because the more management groups you have, the more complicated it's going to be to manage. I would say, depending on the structure of the organization, start small and then go from there. Definitely have different management groups for each line of business, and then have one for core services, which is going to be your IT services. So networking, your networking would be coming up there. Security would be coming up there. So let's say if you have hub and spoke, might even be a different management group depending on how you want to set that up. So core services would be a management group, but subscriptions, I've seen some people have 24 subscriptions, and to me that's way too many. Just have a handful of subscriptions. It's easier to manage that way. And talking about that, obviously you cannot have a single subscriptions because there are limitations on subscriptions as well. You would have multiple subscriptions, but don't go crazy with subscriptions having 20 or 30 subscriptions within one management group, because it's going to be difficult to manage. You need to really figure out why do you want to have that many subscriptions, because it's also going to slow down the process, your workflow as well. So this actually gives a great example of how it should be done. So you want to ensure, from a separation of duty standpoint, you can do from a test and dev versus production. You can do different end customers. I've seen ISVs, they have different subscriptions for each customer. I've seen some companies, they create resource groups for each customer. So it really depends on how the business is laid out. You can do it on a different business unit, or you can even do on a project. So let's say you have a major application project there, you can create a management group or subscription based on that. So yeah, the use cases are endless. It really depends on how you want to do it. And then let's take an example. So this is the management from a management group hierarchy. Let's take a look at this. So you have the corporate IT. So this would be your root management group. And then you'll create production, development, QA. These are 3 different management groups. And then these are the subscriptions where you have the resource groups. So it depends how you want to do it. You can apply RBAC up here, apply the Azure policies here, and it will trickle down. The only challenge is with tagging. Tagging does not do inheritance. So, that's you have to go on the resource level for that. So we already see, so from this is also another example where we see, okay, this is business unit, geographical, you're separating out the geography, and then you're separating out the environment as well. So this is another good example of how you can do it. This is production, non-production, and then production. This could be production and non-production, and then different subscription, and then the resource groups coming under. And the policies, Azure policies, would be applied all over. So you can apply Azure policies up here on this level, and then they will trickle down. So it makes it easier from a management standpoint, permissioning, security standpoint to manage the environment. So now I'm going to move into Azure Blueprint. So I'm not going to talk too much about Azure Blueprint because, as I mentioned, Azure Blueprint is still in preview. Has been preview for 2.5 years now. Hopefully, Microsoft makes this GA soon. That would be ideal. But what this does is, Azure with Azure Blueprint, it makes deploying landing zones a repeatable process. So you would configure your role-based access controls, your policies, your templates, you would compose, and then the Azure Blueprint is basically going to manage everything for you and make it easier from that. And the beauty of that is you can scale your packages. And so let's talk about, first landing zone. So how difficult is it to move into the first landing zone? Looking at this chart, I guess, the most difficult piece is going to be your networking and data. Identity, I would say, is still in the middle somewhere. Policies is pretty much, really less complicated, but from a governance standpoint, it has the highest requirement, because from a governance standpoint, you need to figure out, okay, what compliances do we have to abide by? And then based on that, you'll have to implement policies. Like, we talk about GDPR. You'll have to have a policy that no data, if you have to abide by GDPR, no data would be outside of those data centers or those regions. And then expanding the landing zone. So these are the three main categories. You're going to be doing the hosting, the Azure fundamentals, and then the governance consideration. So these are the three categories of main pillars, if you will, on how the landing zone is going to be expanding. And then from a cloud adoption framework, these are the main fundamentals. So Azure fundamentals, networking, identity, and some of them we've already seen in the core design, but some like storage and databases, that was not in the core design, but this is important as well. Because let's say if you're moving into the IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you'll need compute, storage, and networking. So those three become critical piece for you. So that's why you need to account for those areas, and then that's why the guidance has to be there. And then lastly, cost management. You want to make sure that cost is always under control. So now let's talk about Azure Policy. So why use Azure Policy, or what exactly is Azure Policy? So before I jump into talking about why we should be using it, so Azure Policy is used to create, assign, and manage policies to help enforce compliance and enable auditing for Azure environment. Because you might have a compliance requirement, you might have a, you can even do Azure Policy for costing as well. So let's take a look and see some use cases. Scenario. So what happens with Azure policies is, and I don't like enforcing the policy because the challenge with enforcing the policy is going to be, you might have a lot of issues. Go into audit mode, start auditing the policies, and then taking a look, and then you want to enforce. Yeah, there are exceptions. So there is one exception where I would say you want to enforce policy, that is for tagging. So for example, if somebody is provisioning a new resource, virtual machine, storage, whatever it may be, if they're not attaching a tag, they cannot provision that. So Azure Policy has to be enforced on that. The other is from a policy standpoint, you want to enforce, you want to start denying policy where from a compliance standpoint. So meaning you only allow the regions where the data can reside. So so in Canada, we have 2 data centers or 2 regions. So by enforcing Azure Policy, any user would not be able to provision any resources, the resources outside of that Canadian region. So that policy can be enforced. The other one that I also like is using VM SKUs. So you should also have Azure policies for only allowing specific virtual machine SKUs. So everybody's just not going and spinning up number of VMs. So I've seen that some people were working with the customer, and some people were spinning up N series, which are high GPU virtual machines, spinning up for for basic workloads. Sure, there are obviously going to be exceptions. So if you're going to be running CAD or those kind of softwares, yeah, sure. If the requirement is there, then you can do it. There are obviously going to be exceptions, but generally speaking, you should also have a excuse me, from a governance standpoint, pick up or choose a virtual machine SKU or a series. So for example, you say, okay, we're only going to be using D series for our regular workloads. And then you can start choosing a S3 or, VS3, those kind of things, depending on what the need is and what is needed to make sure there's uniformity as well. Otherwise, everybody's going to be going and spinning up different sorts of VMs. So those are things that you can enforce with Azure Policy. There's so much more you can do with Azure Policy, but I think that's the biggest things that you can do with Azure Policy. And I know we're almost out of time, but that's the session for today. So, do we have any questions from the audience?
Not yet, but I have a question.
Sure.
And first of all, thank you for your presentation. I think it's a great resource.
My pleasure.
But I want to ask about that you can recommend any resources or any books about Azure landing zones or other stuff.
Yeah, so Microsoft actually, Microsoft documentation, right? Microsoft does a great job of having laying out the CAF, Cloud Adoption Framework, and it has the landing zone as well. And if you guys want to learn, I've written a series of blog posts for Azure Landing Zone. Actually, there are multiple blogs posts I've written, so go take a look at that. But again, Microsoft documentation is phenomenal. It's not what if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would say go read a book, but they do a phenomenal job of keeping that thing up to date now. And the biggest challenge I've found with books is that when you buy books, within a couple of months or even weeks, they might go old because Microsoft changes the UI or the setting is changed or Microsoft is adding services at such a rapid pace that I feel like that books, sometimes are challenging to keep up with.
Okay, I think following you is another great resource about this topic.
Yeah.
And I think we don't have any questions. Thank you very much, Abdul. And I hope to see you in further episodes for different topics.
Absolutely. It would be my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I
You're
really
welcome.
enjoyed.
And thank you very much. Cheers.